Daf no 10 lines from the bottom. We're in the middle of a shaila. We have a shaila if the kohen gadol, the power of the kohen gadol, does it oisa tmura or does it not make tmura? The din by tmura is, the basic din by tmura is that tmura, in exchange, if someone wants to substitute a korban, the Torah says, Vayehu tmurasi kodesh, that only applies by a korban yachid, not by a korban sibor. The question is, by the power of the kohen gadol, since he brings it, it can be viewed as a korban yachid. However, the kapara is on behalf of his household and the other kahanim. So do we say that we view it from the perspective of the kahanim, and therefore it's considered to be a korban of shutfim, and therefore there's no tmura? Or do we say no, that kapara that the kahanim have, that's not mekivya, that's mekuf. That over there is, so to speak, floating above. That is bekufya. It is not, they're not considered to be shutfim. It's a kapara that they get from the korban of the kohen gadol. So therefore, that was the shaila. Is there a din of tmura here, or is there not tmura? We wanted to bring a raya from the brisa that said chaymer bezevach tmura, that the zevach, the korbanos, have a chumra over tmura, and chaymer tmura over zevach. The chaymer of the zevach is that the zevach is noyeg betzibor kibiyachid. The zevach is noyeg by a korban, by the tzibor. It's a korban tzibor, it's a korban yachid. Mashenke, the tmura is only by a yachid, and the zevach is doich the Shabbos is a tumah. It's doich Shabbos and tumah. Tmura is not. Va'isa tmura, and the zevach can make a tmura, but a tmura can't. So we said, what is this case over here of the korban that you say it's doich Shabbos and tumah? So that means that it's doich Shabbos and tumah. It's mana kavua. It has a fixed time. And it's also tmura. It must be therefore a korban yachid. So what is a case where you have a korban yachid, which is doich Shabbos and tumah? It has to be a korban yachid because says it's a tmura. Only a korban yachid makes tmura, and yet it's also doich Shabbos and tumah. So what is such a case? It can't be a regular case of a korban yachid because that's not zman kamur. Must be the case of the power of the kohen gadol. And you see, it says that it makes a tmura. The Gemara was doich of the raya, and Rosh Hashanah says no, it's not a raya because it could be talking about the aisle of Aaron, not the par, which is bar on behalf of the other kahanim. It could be the aisle. Now the Gemara continues, and Rosh Hashanah says halchanam mistaber, and it's mistaber to say that what we're talking about is the aisle and not the par. This halgadaitel devara, because if you would say that we're talking about the par of the kohen gadol, tmura the par. If you're saying the tmura the par of Shabbos with tumuhu deloy docha ha b'chol makiv gabra, meaning we're contrasting the zevach to the tmura. We're saying that by a zevach it's doich Shabbos and tumah. Mashen kain a tmura, but tmura is not doich Shabbos and tumah. But that implies the tmura is not doich Shabbos and tumah. But in a regular day and a regular weekday and when it's Torah, you could be makriv it. Well, if we're talking about the power of the kohen gadol, is that so? So is that so? Tmura the par. If we're talking about the tmura the par of Shabbos, the tumuhu deloy have a whole makriv karva, you would say that you would be able to be makriv it. The tmura of the par, ha tmura chatasi. The par is a korban chatas. And by the case of a chatas, of a korban chatas, a tmura of a chatas, you're not makriv it. Now, even though it's hayahu tmura also yakalish, but you're not makriv it. It has to be left. The tmura is chatas l'mizazla. It has to be left to die. So therefore, apparently what we're saying here is that the zevach you're makriv it. With the Shabbos you can be makriv the Shabbos and the tumah. At tmura you count, which implies that, however, on a weekday, which is Torah, you could be makriv. But if it's a tmura of the chatas of the par, you're not makriv even b'chol. Therefore, isn't mistaber to say that we must be talking about the aisle of the kohen of Aaron, the aisle of the kohen gadol, not the par. The aisle is an oila, and the tmura is an oila. You are makriv. So isn't that a raya that we're talking about the oila and not the par? Gemara says no, that's not a raya. That's not a raya. Lo oila para. Maybe I'll tell you. Really, I'll tell you. We could be talking about the par. the par of the Kohen Gadol. And it's the par that we're saying that is Deicha Shabbos and Tuma, and it's the par that's Oisa Tmura, Umay Tmura, but when it says by Tmura, it's not that way. You're not makvid on Shabbos and Tumah, but it's mashma you are makvid b'chol b'tar shem tumor. It's not talking about the tumor of this korban, the tumor of the par. In general terms, a tumora is not doich Shabbos Tumah, but you are makvid b'chol. So it's shem tumor, not the specific korban. In fact, the Gemara ihacha zevach nami. Well, if that's the case, then say zevach nami. You don't have a raya whether it's the par or the ayal. Then say the same thing, and we shouldn't be talking about a specific korban, and therefore perhaps it's not referring to neither the par nor the ayal. It's not referring to either of them, and it's zevach nami, shem zevach. Say that it's talking about korbanos in general, as zevach in general. That there are korbanos that we say that by a zevach, the korbanos that are doicha Shabbos and Tumah. Now it's not the same korban that's oisa t'mura. Some korbanos are doich Shabbos and Tumah, whereas Zman HaKavua. Some korbanos are oisa tomorrow, but it's not referring necessarily to the same one. So we're not referring to neither the par or the ayal. So why don't we say the same thing? Where it says no, shem zevach like Katani. We're not here referring to in general terms of zevach. Here, when we're talking about the zevach, we're referring to a specific korban. Mimai, what's my proof? Because the Sefer says, it talks about the chumras that the tmura has over the zevach. Now, an animal that has a mum, if a person's makdish an animal that has a mum for a zevach, for a korban, it doesn't have kedushas aguf. It doesn't have kedushas aguf, and it can become a chulin. It can be poidet, and it can become chulin gomer. Something that has kedushas haguf, then when you're poidet, it is not yoitze as chulin gomer. So a zevach, then we say that the zevach is not chal al a balmum kavua, a permanent blemish. It does not have kedushas haguf. It does not have kedushas haguf if the animal has a permanent blemish. However, by a tmura has a chumrah. Tmura is not like that. If a person takes an animal that has a mum kavua, and he says he wants to make it a substitute for a tmura for a korban, and he says this animal, even though it has a mum kavua, he wants to make it a tmura for the korban. It's chal on that tmura, a kedusha, and a kedusha saguf, and therefore it cannot be redeemed to be chulin gomer. Therefore, when it's redeemed, therefore it is used. It can be used as chulin, but not ligaz v'lavet. You cannot work with it. You cannot shear it. You can't use the milk. It does not go out lechulin for chulin gomer. So that is the chumrah that Tmura has over the zevach. Now, now, if you're saying that we're talking about in general terms of zevach, we're not referring to a specific korban that is doich Shabbos and Tumah, and as I said tomorrow, we're talking about a shem zevach in general terms. Well, then this would not be so, because even by the case of the zevach, then you'd say also by the zevach, it's chal al balmum kavua, because we do have a case of a zevach that is chal on a balmum kavua. B'chor meiser the chal al balmum kavua. They are chal al balmum kavua. If the firstborn has a permanent blemish, nevertheless it has a kedusha saguf. If the 10th animal to come out of the pen, and he designated number 10, and it happens to have a mum kavua, it has a kedusha saguf, and you're not pointed. So therefore, and therefore they cannot be redeemed to use to work for it and shear them. So therefore, we're not talking about a shem zevach, because we're talking about a korban that's doicha Shabbos and doicha Tumah, and it's oisa tomorrow. And on the other hand, it's not chal on a balmum kavua. Now, if we're talking in general terms, there are korbanos that are doich Shabbos and Tumah. There are korbanos that are make it tomorrow, but there also are korbanos that are chal on balmum kavua. Elamai, by the zevach, we must be talking about a specific korban, not in general terms. Elashem zevach like Katani. So therefore, you see, we're talking about a specific korban. So Maishna Tamura. So why is it that we differentiate over here? Why does the Tana? Yes, you're correct. You're right. That by the Tamura, he could be talking about a Shem Tamura. But by Zevach, he's talking about a specific example. Why should he differentiate? Why would he differentiate in that way? If he's talking about, in general terms, the Zevach, why not by Tamura saying the same thing? Because the more answers, Shem Tamura Achasi. The answer is that Shem Tamura Achas, the halachas of Tamura are consistent. They apply across the board. There's one set of halachas. So therefore, in terms of the Tamura, you can talk about the Shem of Tamura. You can talk about it in general terms, not without referring to one specific case. But Zevach, but the case of the korbanos of the Zevach, then it's not across the board. It's not across the board because Ika Bechor, Vika Meiser. You have exceptions like the case of Bechor Meiser. Therefore, you cannot talk in general terms. You can't talk about across the board. You have to talk about a specific Zevach. Are we talking about Bechor Meiser? Are we talking about other korbanos? Therefore, by Zevach, it's referring specifically to a korban. So therefore, if you're saying that there's a Zevach, that is Doicha Shabbos and Tuma, and it's Isa Tamura, and it's not Halal Balmum Kavua, well, we have to be talking about a specific korban, and therefore we could be talking about either the power of the Kohen Gadol or the ayal of the Kohen Gadol. Frank the moral Sheshes that who wanted to say that we're talking about the Kohen Gadol, that we're saying we're not talking about the Kohen Gadol's power, he gave an alternative and he said we're talking about the ayal. So Gemara asks, according to Rosh Hashanah, why do you want to now deflect the raya that we're talking about the power of the Kohen Gadol and give an alternative that we're talking about the ayal? There's another alternative. Well, Rosh Hashanah, why are you suggesting that we're talking the alternative could be the ayal of Aaron? Look me b'Pesach. Why don't you say we're talking about a Korban Pesach? Well, that's another alternative. The Doich Shabbos, that's a Tuma. The Korban Pesach is also Doich Shabbos and Tuma. V'Aisa Tamura. And since it's a Korban Yochid, it makes Tamura. The Korban Yochid. So why isn't that an alternative? And as Tesis explains, he says, and that would be preferable because we're talking in the Bryce about a Zevach. And the reference in the pasuk of is to the Korban Pesach. The pasuk refers to the Korban Pesach as Zevach Pesach. So that's referred to specifically as a Zevach. So why isn't that a better alternative to suggest that we're talking about the Korban Pesach rather than the ayal of the Kohen Gadol? Gemara answers, Kasavar ein sheichtem Pesach ala yochid. He holds that no, we would not consider the Korban Pesach as a Korban Yochid l'gabei Tamura, and therefore there is no Tamura for it. Why is that? Because Rosh Hashanah holds that you can't shech the Korban Pesach for one person. There has to be more than one person in the Chabura. They have to have more than one person in the Chabura, and therefore we would not consider it, as far as Tamura is concerned, we would not consider it a Korban Yochid, we would consider it as a Korban of Shutfim, and it's Einoi Tamura, therefore that's not a viable alternative. Well, why don't you say we're talking about Pesach Sheni? Now, Pesach Sheni, you can't shecht it for a Yochid, and therefore, why don't we say the case is talking about Pesach Sheni, which would also have these attributes of Doicha Shabbos and Tuma, and it's Isa Tamura because it's a Korban Yochid. The Gemara says, Mi Dochi Tuma? Is a Pesach Sheni is a Doicha Tuma? It's not Doicha Tuma, and therefore that's not an alternative. So we'll see, the Gemara will discuss this, as far as being a Doicha Tuma, we'll discuss this shortly. Now we learned on Daf Nun Amud Aleph that the Tanna Kama held that the rule is that a Korban Tzibur is Doicha Shabbos and Tuma, not a Korban Yochid. And on that we had Tanoim then asked on that Bukhara is not the Klal. So Rameir asked on that, is that a Klal? I'll show you a Korban Yochid, that even though it's a Korban Yochid, it is Doicha Shabbos and Tuma. Rameir said, Amar lo Rameir v'loi par Yom Kippur v'chavita Kohen Gadol u'Pesach, the Korban Yochid, and Doicha Shabbos v'esa Tuma. So even though they're Korban Yochid, they are Doicha Shabbos and Tuma. And Amar lo Rav Yaakov la par helam dover shel tzibur usiri avodas kocham v'chagiga. The Korban Tzibur, these are Korban Tzibur. They ain't Doichim loisa Shabbos loisa Tuma. They're not Doicha, so that is not the Klal. So, for the Gemara, Amalei Rav Huna B'Rei Rav Shua L'Rava V'Tana, the Tana Maishna of that Mishnah Bryce that we learned before. Maishna Pesach L'Karlei Korban Yochid. Now he calls a Pesach Korban Yochid, and that was an example of a Korban Yochid that is Deicha Shabbos and Tumah. Umayshna Chagiga Dara Karlei Korban Tzibur, and the Chagiga, the Korban Chagiga, he gave it an example of a Korban Tzibur that's not Deicha Shabbos and Tumah. So why does he call the Korban Pesach Korban Yochid, and why does he call it Chagiga? Why does he call it Korban Tzibur? Now, in both cases, it's the individuals that bring it. It's not a typical Korban Tzibur that the Korban is brought on behalf, one Korban is brought on behalf of the whole nation. Here, it's brought individually by the separate people. So why should Pesach be referred to as a Korban Yochid, and why should the Chagiga be referred to as a Korban Tzibur? If you say it's referred to a Korban Tzibur, the Chagiga is a Korban Tzibur because it's brought on the Shalosh Garments when all the Klal Yisrael come together, to gather together, and it comes with a kinufa, with an assembly. So, and that's why it's considered a Korban Tzibur. Pesach Nami also b'kinufia. Well, that's so too by the Korban Pesach, and it has to be brought on Yud Dalet and Nisan, and they all come together and they separate in three chaboras and three kitos, and they bring the Korban Pesach. So, what should be the difference? Rava says, "Ika Pesach Sheni Delas b'kinufia." Eina Chanami. That the Korban Pesach, we would consider it a Korban Tzibur in this regard because it's also B'kinufa. It comes B'kinufa, and it would be considered a Korban Tzibur. But the kasha is, when we're saying that Pesach is a Korban Yochid and it's Doicha, we're including in it the Pesach Sheni. And Pesach Sheni does not come B'kinufia. It's only a minority only Yechidim, or a minority of Klal Yisrael that brings the Pesach Sheni. A majority of Klal Yisrael don't bring the Pesach Sheni. So therefore, there is not Bob the Kinufia. It's considered to be a Korban Yochid. Amrlei Rav Huna Rav Yeshua said to Rava, Im Kain, Doichas Shabbos Veshatuma. Well, if that's the case, that you're saying when Tana refers to Pesach, he's referring to the Pesach Rishon and Sheni, it's referring to Sheni as well. Well, then you should say, when the Tana says that Pesach is Doich Shabbos and Tumah, well, that should mean, therefore, that Pesach Sheni is also Doich Shabbos and Tumah. Is that really the case? Amar Lei says, yes, this Mishnah holds that that's the case. Kiman Damar Dochi. He holds like the Man Domer, who says that even Pesach Sheni is Deicha. That's how we learned in the Brisa, Pesach Sheni, Deicha Shabbos, Sheni Deicha Tumah. The Pesach Sheni is Deicha Shabbos, but it's not Deicha Tumah. That's what Tanakama says. And Rav Yehuda Omer Av Deicha Tumah. And he says it is Deicha Tumah. He says it's Deicha both. He is Deicha there, Shabbos and Tumah. So you see that he holds that Pesach Sheni is considered to be a korban that is Doich Shabbos and Tumah. So therefore the Mishnah, when it says Pesach, the Tana, when it says Pesach, is referring to Pesach Sheni as well. Now the Gemara explains, my time of the Tanakama, why should the Tanakama differentiate between Shabbos and Tumah? So the Pasuk says, B'moyedai. It says that you bring the korban B'moyedai. Now it says B'moyedai, it says that when it says Moedai, we normally darshan it to mean that you bring it at this appointed time, even if it's Shabbos and even if it's Betuma. So therefore, you should say that you bring it b'moedai. Therefore, it should come and be Doicha Shabbos, and it should be brought Betuma as well. But my time of the Tanakama, why does he say that it does not come Betuma? We understand why it's Doicha Shabbos, but why is it not Doicha Tumah? Amar Lach, he says, Mipnei Tumasa Dechisai. You were Doicher and you did not bring it on Pesach Rishon because of Tumah, because you want to be able to bring it B'tara. Ve'asa B'tumah, and now you should say that bring it B'tumah. You're going to say bring it B'tumah if you were Doicher and then you say no, don't do Pesach Rishon, and you should be doichet Pesach Sheni, you should say it should come betuma. So, meaning, as the way Tosfos explains it, the reasoning behind it is, even on a deeper level, is that the Pesach Rishon comes betuma only if it's a roiv tzibur. If it's ish, then if a person that is tomei is unable to do the Pesach Rishon, he's nitcha to Pesach Sheni. That is an ish, an individual, or a minority of Klal Yisrael. But the majority, if it's a roiv tzibur, they do Pesach Rishon betuma. But a miut does not do betuma. They're nitcha. They don't. Now, are you going to say that the Pesach Sheni, which is only comes as a so to speak, a b'diavad, meaning you couldn't do the Pesach Rishon, you do the Pesach Sheni, it should be even more and stronger than the Pesach Rishon. The Pesach Rishon itself, if it's a minority of Klal Yisrael, they don't do the Pesach Rishon. The Pesach Sheni that comes as a substitute, so to speak, for Pesach Rishon, are you going to say that even a minority should be able to do it betuma? Rav Yehuda says, no, it is brought betuma. You do the Pesach Sheni with all the halachas of Pesach Rishon. So therefore, vafil betuma. Therefore means you bring it even betuma. Now, a Pesach Rishon, if Klal Yisrael is tamei, if the roiv tzibur is tamei, is brought betuma. The Torah gave it an opportunity to do the Korban Pesach b'tahara. So if the Yachid was tamei by Pesach Rishon, he does Pesach Sheni. But lo yisocha yasen betuma. But if he's not zoicha and he is not able to do the Pesach b'tahara, he's tamei even by Pesach Sheni, then yasa betuma. The Tanakhama said, well, how can it be more than the Pesach Rishon? No, the Pesach Rishon is when roiv tzibur are tamei, they do it betuma. If there's a miut, well, since Pesach Rishon comes with the whole nation, if there's only a miut, it's nitcha to Pesach Sheni. But by Pesach Sheni itself, by definition, it's only a miut that is nitcha to Pesach Sheni. It's only a miut that does Pesach Sheni. Therefore, this reasoning doesn't apply. It's only a miut in itself that is nitcha to the Pesach Sheni. So therefore, there's no difference over here in this regard if it is a miut or a roy, because it's only miut tzibur to begin with that does Pesach Sheni. Therefore, just like we say that by Pesach Rishon, if the tzibur is tamei, they do it. Here also, that if the tumah by Pesach Sheni, therefore they should be able to do the Pesach Sheni, because there is no significance in a roiv tzibur, because the roiv tzibur doesn't do Pesach Sheni to begin with.